Thank you. Well, one can't open the newspaper or watch the news today without reading about the financial crises that are surrounding us. So what I want to do today is just update you on Carleton's financial framework and where we're at, and as we kind of crystal ball the next couple of years, where are we headed. This is an outline of my presentation. I'm going to start with sort of the bottom line of where we're at today, and then I'll try and explain why I think that's where we're at. All Ontario universities are facing a very difficult time. For Carleton, I think it's probably for the next 3 years is going to be much like the time that we went through in the mid-90s, for those of you that were here at that time. We, in our financial planning, do a 3-year rolling budget, which requires us in thinking about how much money we have to spend this year to try and crystal ball what our revenue and expenditures are going to be in 2011 and 12. I think for this year and for next year, 2009 and 10, we are probably in a relatively stable, static time. I don't see a lot of staffing changes at Carleton, either one way or the other, for the next couple of years. But 2010 and 11 is actually looking like a very bad year for us. And there's two reasons for it. Number one is the pension plan, and I'll talk about it in more detail. But it's, I think, a very high probability that in 2010-11, the university will be required to make extraordinary payments to our pension plan. And secondly, it's the Ontario government's support for universities. So we will see in a minute that we get about half of our annual operating income from a grant from the Ontario government. And there's actually no increase in the grant this year, and there's no forecast increase in that grant next year. And so this causes for actually all Ontario universities a very difficult time. We are about a $500 million a year financial operation. Today I'm just going to talk about the operating budget, though. That's what pays our salaries and allows us to thrive as an academic institution. So we get about half our money from a government grant, and we get the other half from tuition fees and miscellaneous fees. Now, all of this is student-based. So there's a very complex system for the government grant manual. It's about 60 pages long, where different types of students generate a different grant, and similarly different types of students generate different tuition fees. But our financial well-being is totally dependent on students, and it's really dependent on undergraduate students. Graduate students are, in rough terms, revenue cost neutral. We pay almost as much for graduate student support as we get in graduate student tuition fees and the government grant to support them. So what allows us to move ahead in a financial sense is the undergraduate student enterprise. And how do we spend our money? Well, probably not surprisingly, we spend roughly 3/4 of our expenditures are on salaries and benefits. And then when you look at those other little pieces of pies, there's not a lot of discretionary money in there. There's utilities, student support, but you know, what flexibility do we have in our operating budget? Ultimately, it comes down to the 3/4 of the pie that's salaries and benefit costs. Now, the university budget's really not that complicated. On the revenue side, it's how many students do we have here, undergraduates and graduates? We control that. How much money do we get per student? That's either a tuition fee or a government grant. That's totally controlled by the province of Ontario. They decide what we can do with tuition fees, and they decide what the grant per student is going to be. So we're kind of half in control of our revenue. The government's in control of the other half. On the expenditure side, we're totally in control of it. And the two major issues that I'm going to talk about today are what's going on with the pension plan and inflationary costs, the fact that our expenses are going up more than our income. Just talking about the number of students. So the bottom of this line is our projection for the number of first-year undergraduate students we're forecasting in the next 3 years. This isn't a fairly aggressive, it doesn't look like a lot, it's a 2.5% increase per year, but it's a fairly aggressive target given what's happening to the high school demographics in the province. There will continue to be an increase in the number of high school graduates next year, but then particularly in the Ottawa area it starts to decline. But that increase in the number of first-year students actually drives the sort of the total increase in the size of the undergraduate student body, and that's really what determines our financial health. So if we achieve this target, I think financially in the next 3 years we're going to be okay. If we don't achieve this target, we're going to be in financial trouble, right? That's where we're headed. So for all of you and all of your role, that it helps in actually the recruiting or retaining students, we all have a role to play in that, and it's an important role. Switching to the pension plan, I'm going to talk about it for about 2 minutes probably in total, but I would encourage all of you, if you're interested in it, Betsy Springer and Neil Courtemanche are having a series of events to inviting the campus community. They'll talk about the pension plan for about an hour, and so I would encourage you all, if you are interested, to go and partake in that. So this is what our pension plan performance has been over the years. We have an actuarial assumption in the plan that will actually perform at a plus 6.5% per year. So what's happened from September to December, the minus 18% drop in our plan, which is just reflective of what's going on in equity markets in the world, is a significant problem for us. We are governed under pensions legislation by the province of Ontario. So every pension plan is required to file a formal valuation with the province of Ontario at least every 3 years, or as you can see, we've done it more frequently in recent years. You do 2 tests. First is a going concern test, which means do you have enough money in your pension plan to honor the pension promise that you made either to retirees or serving members. The second test is a solvency test, which assumes that you wind up your pension plan and you take all of the money available and you put it in a guaranteed investment certificate, and then do you have enough money to honor your pension commitment. So the first test, the going concern, is very dependent on the performance of your pension plan, the financial performance of your plan. So as you can see in the previous overhead, this minus 18% compared to an actuarial assumption of a plus 6.5 causes us a significant problem with the going concern. And the solvency is totally dependent on long-term interest rates. So we know that long-term interest rates are at an all-time low. There's pressure on central governments around the world to continue to reduce those. And so the lower interest rates are, the bigger the pot of money you need to have when you go buy that guaranteed investment certificate or you make that assumption. So we need to make our next valuation of our plan no later than July 2010. Looking at sensitivity analysis of what might happen with long-term interest rates, or what would be reasonable assumptions about performance of our pension plan over the next 17 months now. We think that it's highly likely, or it's probably virtually guaranteed, that we're going to be required to make extraordinary annual payments in our pension plan of order of $10 to $20 million a year. Now, just to put that in context, if we go to the middle of that and say it's $15 million a year, that's about 8% of our payroll. So that's really going to be a major challenge for us, right? Yeah. Now, we've, since we had the tech bubble burst in the early 2000s, we've been aware of our pension plan funding as an issue. So we've been setting aside money. So we do have a $15 million reserve in our operating fund, which might help us for 1 year of our extraordinary payments, but it's certainly not a long-term solution. The board has directed us to try and identify additional funds to set aside as we go through the budget cycle this year. And there are about 12 Ontario universities that have either defined benefit or hybrid plans that are really disadvantaged by this solvency valuation. Now, we've been arguing with the Ontario government for 4 years that requiring Ontario universities to do solvency valuations doesn't make any sense at all, right? There's never been a Canadian university closed. And perchance there was a Canadian university that closed. We have a lot of assets that we're actually not allowed to bring into play when we do the solvency valuation. You know, we have a lot of physical infrastructure, we have a lot of stuff here, but all we can do is take whatever money is actually in our pension plan. And so we've been arguing this really doesn't make any sense. Unsuccessfully so far. I think the Ontario government's reluctance is around, they don't want to treat university pension plans different than the other, whatever, there is 2,800 pension plans in the province. But anyways, we continue that lobby, and maybe we'll be successful. And then just my last point on this, we did a snapshot of the Ontario universities of what our extraordinary payments to all of our pension plans would need to be on October 31st, 2008. And so all Ontario universities would have to put in about $530 million a year if we did evaluations on that particular date. So it doesn't give me a lot of comfort, but it's a problem we share with other institutions. Our second problem, go back to one of the earlier overheads. We get about half of our income from a government grant. No increase in the government grant this year, and there's no forecast increase for the following year. And when we look at the economy of the province of Ontario, which is now shrinking, you know, it's very difficult to actually foresee that the Ontario government is going to be able to become very generous with the post-secondary education as we look forward. So that will likely continue to be challenged. Tuition fees this year, the government announced 4 years ago a 5-year reaching higher framework that allows to put up tuition fees on average 5% a year. Next year is the last year of that. Carleton and all Ontario universities will be taking the maximum allowed under this framework. Then we fall into a policy vacuum. The province hasn't said what they're doing in 2010, 11, and 12. We are assuming in our planning that the tuition fee framework will continue, but we will probably have to wait at least a year to find out what their plans are. So our income in total is going up about 2.5% a year. When we look at, that's from tuition fees going up, of our total income up is going up 2.5% a year because the government grant's not increasing. Whereas our expenses, our inflationary costs, mainly driven by salary costs, are going up close to 5% a year. Now, once again, this is not unique to Carleton. All Ontario universities are facing this problem. Handling it in different ways, I think, if you pay attention to what's going on at other universities today. This has been our planning framework that we've had in place since the late 1990s. The green line, which is the top line, is our total forecast income. So you can see our income in the planning period is forecast to go up by about $10 million a year. Well, that's totally dependent on us meeting those undergraduate enrollment targets that we've set for ourselves. And it's also dependent on the government allowing us to put up tuition fees in year 2, 3 of the planning framework. And the blue line is our base expenditures, the amount that we're actually spending on permanent base ongoing commitments. This small gap here is between the blue line and the green line is money that we have been for the last few years spending on fiscal one-time money. It's mainly for capital renovations or equipment renewal. Because those blue line and green lines are not actually perfectly together, that's why we have a bit of a cushion against our the fact that our income is not as growing as much as we would like either this year or next year. For this reason, I think in our framework, we're actually not looking at any budget reductions, whereas if you look around the Ontario university system today, 3/4 of the universities are into fairly significant budget cuts now of between 5% and 8%, right? Anyways, this planning framework is the reason that we're not into it, actually. Uh-oh. We'll get it. Can you help me? So what can we all do to help ourselves? So we're not actually, there's a lot of things that we at Carleton can be doing. The first is, and Fairden has talked about it and Roseanne already, about the student experience. How are we going to meet these enrollment targets going forward? I think it's greatly determined by the experience that our students have here today. They come and they have a good experience at Carleton, and they go away and tell their younger sister or brother or their friend, you know, I went to Carleton and I had a great experience. And I think all staff and faculty have a major role to play in that. Our retention rates are not as good as they should be. The retention rates, students being successful in university, are greatly determined by their high school entry averages. We're at about the middle of the pack in Ontario today, but there are a few universities that have the same entry average as us that are retaining 2 to 3% more of their students, right? And those would have a significant financial, and probably it's just a good thing to do as well. We need to look at programs where we have spare capacity, ensuring we can fill them up. Already talked about graduate student growth that today and for the last 5 years. We've actually paid almost exactly the amount of money in graduate student support as we've got in graduate student income. And that does not take into account any of the teaching resources we're using actually to teach or support those graduate students. So if we could find a way to actually attract graduate students and pay them less money, that would be a very good thing for us. Scholarship program, the University of Ottawa and Carleton have very similar and the most generous undergraduate scholarship programs in the province. We now have a project underway with U of O to see if we could actually, for the first time in history, work with them to bring that down a little bit, so maybe that'll work. And I think we need to continue to look at renewing our academic programs, right? So we're attractive for prospective students, undergraduate and graduate, to come to Carleton. So that's it. So I'm going to turn it over to George.